Namaste, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Nikunj Trivedi. I'm the president of the Coalition of Hindus of North America, or CONA. Today, we have a very special session, a discussion about Carnegie Endowment's recent survey on Indian Americans. What does it really mean for Hindu Americans? What are some of the good points, some of the not so good points? What is the survey all about? Why are we talking about this today? What are some of the key points that we all need to keep in mind as Hindu Americans? So we're going to have a discussion about this. Joining with me is Richa Gautamji. Richa ji is a steering committee member of CONA, and she's going to be presenting. So today's format is going to be as follows. We're going to have a quick presentation with Richa ji, about 15-20 minutes. That's going to lay out the overall survey, some of the key findings that they have, and some of the points that they have outlined. Overall, there are some good points, and then there are certain concerns that we, as CONA and as Hindu Americans, have. But there's also some good findings in the survey as well. So we're going to do a presentation real quick, followed by a kind of a discussion between Richa ji and I about some of the finer points within the survey, and then we'll open it up to question and answers. So if you are going to ask questions, please post them on the Facebook chat or the YouTube comments box, and we're going to be reviewing them as we go. So Richa ji, let's go right into the survey. Maybe you can start with your presentation.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Nikunji. I'm so used to doing surveys on, brands and corporate stuff. So this is much more exciting, I think, at this time, because Carnegie Endowment has come up with a very important survey. I think we can go to the next slide, Nikunji. The main important thing is that, we have reached a critical mass in the United States as Indian Americans. And so, it is important for us to have a better identity. Like I said, when I do surveys and understand demographics, largely, Asian Americans and Asian American Pacific Islanders are usually clubbed in together, and the understanding of their consumer behavior or their media habits and all are usually kind of seen as a cohesive monolith. So this is a welcome step to understand how we actually behave and what is our real, standing and identity. So this is a good survey. It's a robust survey design. There's a good stratified sampling system and weighting process. So it ensures a very robust projectable data most of the time. I understood from one of the reports that I saw that Republicans are underrepresented. Now, Carnegie Mellon did 3 parts of the survey to understand Indian Americans, how they behave politically in the US, what they think of India politically, what's the climate right there. And then also now the third aspect, which I think is a lot more interesting to us at CONA right now, because it looks at the social and cultural aspects. So going on to the next slide. I just wanted to point this out. I mean, we are at 4.2 million as Indian Americans, in this country right now, based on the census data. And, the entire Carnegie Endowment study is based on the American Community Survey, which is based off of the census. So there's a little bit of difference, if you see the numbers, naturalized citizen, it's pretty close, like 33% of the Indian Americans are naturalized citizens, which makes a lot of sense. A lot of us came on H visas and student visas and whatnot. And then 29%, according to ACS, which is the American Community Survey, were born in the USA, and 38% are non-citizen. Now, Carnegie Endowment, I'm sorry, is using these numbers most of the time because they have oversampled the born in the USA group, because they did want to understand the second generation versus the first, generation Indian Americans, and the difference and the, differentiating factors between them. So maybe that is the reason. I would definitely want a discussion on this with someone in the team there, to see why there's a huge discrepancy. As you can see in ACS, is 29% versus Carnegie Endowment has 37% as the born in the USA group. But going on to the next slide, I just wanted to touch upon that. I'm not going to go into this kind of a detailed statistic anymore. So, just be rest assured. Then we're going into, I think some of the most critical issues that we want to understand, religion and caste, right? Because there is a huge differentiation that we see within the community in how they, going on to the next slide, Nikunji, thank you so much. We see, a very different sort of like very interesting, rather, religious identity among the Indian Americans. What I see is, if you see fair representation or proportional representation, I think Muslims are kind of close to what the Indian population is. If you go to India, it's about 14% or so in India. So here you see 13%. That's pretty prorated if you see. And if you see the Christian population here among the Indian Americans, it's, I think, 4 plus 5 plus 2. So it's about 11%, which is much higher, right? In India, it's supposed to be, even with the crypto Christians included, about 2 to 5% is what we hear is the Christian population in India. And so 11% is definitely, highly skewed. So there are a lot more Christians. And then when you look at Hindus, 54% identify themselves as Hindus. And if you look at the purple group, which is the atheists and the agnostic group, it's about 16%. So suspiciously, it looks to me that, this is probably largely a Hindu group, because a lot of us do tend to identify ourselves as agnostic. And as Nikunji, pointed out to me, a lot of us do yoga and, maybe breathing exercises and spiritual meditations and things like that, and count that as, but still, calling yourself as a non-Hindu there is, I think, probably one of the, presuppositions we can make, given the kind of grouping we have, and also the kind of studies that have been made in UK. In UK, there has been a huge push among the people to stop identifying themselves as atheists and agnostics, because a lot of the grants and policies that are made by the government are largely dependent on these kind of surveys. So I think this is something as Hindus, they need to watch out for. And one other point that really puzzles me is, where are the Sikhs? Because Sikhs have claimed that they are 500,000 strong in the Indian American community today. And 2020 census actually breaks them out as a separate ethnic group. So where are they? They don't seem to be anywhere in this group, and if unless they're part of the something else, or which I don't understand why. But I just wanted to point out some of the puzzlements of this page. Going on to the next slide, so it just sort of shows that, Hindus are basically not attending weekly service, whereas Christians and Muslims tend to, mostly, almost half of them, more than half of them in the Christians tend to attend services, So Hindus, going to temples, well, some of them are atheists, but even among the Hindus, as we call them, Hindus in name only, Hinus, I think that seems to be a good acronym, because a lot of them don't really attend services in the temple. On the next slide, again, it sort of just reinforces that, Hindus are the least religious group. If you look at, how they relate to how important is their religious identity. Hindus, just 30% of them say very important, whereas if you see the Muslim and Christian groups, they are, double that number, who think religion is very important to them. So going to the next slide is just a conclusion that Carnegie Endowment has made, that Hindus less likely to report attending religious services, and compared to the Muslims and the Christians. I think we want to move on next to the topic of caste. So I think this is probably the topic of most interest to all of us, because if the kind of noise that is going on around the topic of caste in the country today. And the sad part is that I think Carnegie Endowment is also, to some extent, biased. There is a confirmation bias, because what happens here in the caste surveys, that the completely focus the caste questions only towards the Hindus, So there's a confirmation bias and establishment of the colonial trope of caste, saying that caste is a Hindu phenomenon, which, as we all know, it's a trope. It's not really true. If we go to the next slide, these are some of the notes I have taken from the Carnegie report, and they quote all of the media and Cisco and some of the anonymous testimonials, which they call as drenching testimonials. So while I totally respect the team completely, they have been statistically very sound, but that factor of marking caste as a Hindu phenomenon is visible here during the survey questions, right? If we go on to the next slide, what you find actually is that, I think what we all assume and what we all sort of know in our heart of hearts from the interactions that we have, that when the Hindus were asked, do you identify with a caste, less than 50% said yes, okay? And most of them said no. And when you go to the second generation US-born respondents, even, a third of them only said that, yes, they do have a caste identity. Now, it is very important to know that caste affiliation or caste identity has nothing to do with caste discrimination, right? So I think that is an important point to note here from just a point of understanding. And second important point to note is that the question was framed in a very, very specific way, in the way that, we have questions in India on our forms, in educational institution, in occupational, questionnaires, things like that. So where we have clear reservation quota for SC, ST, and OBC, which is the scheduled castes, tribes, and other backward classes. And so the rest go into the general category. So, people are very, very aware of that identity because all of us are educated people. We go through these forms, we go through these kind of questionnaires in our lifetime. So to say that Hindus are aware of their caste is really, it's like garbage in, garbage out, because if you feed in that question, they are going to say yes, So going on to the next slide, I think couple of things here. So when caste markers are attested, we find caste is not a key marker because less than 50%, and also from a biased questioning method, which I just mentioned, they are saying, yes, they do have a caste identity. Secondly, I would have liked an open-ended question here, from the respondents. If you go to any of the Pew Research on racial studies or any study that looks at racial study, they will have an open-ended question as to what exactly they identify themselves. It's an open-ended understanding because, they want to really understand how people identify themselves. And a lot of people write none of your business or things like that, but the important thing is that sort of questioning should have been there. These are experts. These are people with PhDs in these kind of fields. They should have known exactly how to ask that question to avoid this confirmation bias that they wanted to, that they end up creating in this process. This was a double whammy as far as I could see. But not to forget that only 46% of the Hindu respondents actually related to caste identity. So I think we should go on to the next slide. This is just debunking of the next slide after this, Nikunji, is about just the fact that I think this is Carnegie Endowment Survey's gift to us. We've all been crying hoarse that the Equality Lab survey that has been talking so much about caste as a key marker of the South Asian American population has been completely debunked by the Carnegie team. So they are a pretty strong team to understand that this was not a representative study at all. And, the kind of methods used here were dubious, to say the least. So Carnegie Endowment study completely debunks and, disavows out of the Equality Lab study and its results. And so, I think we have a good reason to celebrate here. On the next page, I think it just sort of reaffirms that it's not based on a representative sample. And again, on the next page, it's just a quick just a study, footnote in their survey where they do talk about the kind of sampling method used there, which is, again, absolutely never, ever used. The snowball sampling method is never used in studies like these, where you want to project data or you want to really understand a population. So I think hats off to the Carnegie team for putting that footnote out there, because it really helps us to have some prestigious organization like that to come out and incontrovertibly say that this is not a good study. Going on to the next slide, in terms of experiencing discrimination. So we just, I think these are the three tops: religion, caste, and then now discrimination. One of the most important things to note is that, most of them have said that they don't face discrimination. If you see the final bar, which is at a height of like over 50%, 60% almost. So people are largely saying that, look, we don't face discrimination here. But among the small sample that did say that they face discrimination, I think color of skin was one of the most key factors. But it's important to note that it's a very, very small sample base. And in that, caste is actually very, very limited. So caste as an identity, as an identifying marker, really does not play significantly in either discrimination, either in identity, or in overall South Asian milieu. So especially the Hindu population. So I think those really are the key points. And Nikunji, going on to the next slide. So this is just the notes from their report, where they say that somewhat surprisingly, Indian Americans born in the United States are much more likely to report being victims of discrimination than their foreign-born counterparts. But, it's largely what we have seen is that discrimination really, most of the questions were answered in the negative. So that's an important and good thing to know, which is what makes America so popular for us. And Nikunji, what's the time? Like, do you want me to go for another 5 minutes to talk about the other indicators? Because I've covered the highlights.
Yeah. I think quickly a few of those economic indicators and political indicators, maybe just quickly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So great. So then I will go on to talk about that. I think as expected, I think most of us know that the political and civic engagement meter is the bar is pretty low for us. We really don't participate in volunteering that much, or calling out our representatives or officials, or being on boards of, education or parks and recreation or whatnot. We don't participate in rallies, but of course we love to have, table discussions, coffee cup revolutions, and you would discuss politics quite a lot with friends and family. I think this next slide is very, very interesting to me, because I think this is a trend which totally mirrors what is going on in the American society in general, that, there's a lot of political polarization between the liberal and the, conservative groups, and that's experienced within the Indian American groups as well. Also in India, it's a very politically charged environment. So of course, we see people reacting very strongly. But what also we see as a similarity is the liberal intolerance, So that is experienced here, where the liberals find it hard to, communicate or accept opinions of the Republicans or and the same is true of the Congress Party, where they don't really like to like the supporters of BJP. So there's a huge polarization based on that, within the community. That's what, in fact, it has come out to be, according to Carnegie Endowment, one of the single biggest. Nikunji, maybe the next slide. Yeah, this is the point. So I'm sorry, I've been, I guess this is the slide I've just spoken to, that there's an asymmetric polarization where the liberal groups are very intolerant of the Republicans. The Congress supporters are very intolerant of the BJP supporters, according to the Carnegie Endowment survey. And on the next slide is just a quote from their report. I think this is going to be available to people to see eventually on YouTube and Facebook. So I just thought to throw it in there that, their key factors of polarization or divisions within the community are largely, they have seen as somewhat religion, political leadership, whether in India or the US, and political parties, same. So those were the key, cleavages, so to speak. And then looking at, economic indicators. So obviously, I think this is the model minority tag that we've worn for so long still stands true. And, mostly we've found, and this trend continues in this data base as well, that, the income bases are higher, education levels are higher. So the only thing that they've noticed is there's a lot of unauthorized immigrants who expectedly live, under levels of poverty, lower than the American average. So that's expected, but I didn't see any numbers as to how many unauthorized immigrants they have here. I didn't see any numbers of that. Next slide is on education. I think this was, of course, there were a lot of other markers which are very similar to what we've seen in past surveys, the very high education level. And the one thing I noticed here is they had some high schoolers and some college students who were still studying. So I did not quote those numbers, but more than 80% are, graduates and above graduate. But what is most important is 52% of Indians in America completed their education in the United States. I think this is a very important. We spend our money here, we learn, get our education here, and Hindu phobia in the schools and college campuses should be actually, we have the political and the monetary clout at this time, at least the monetary clout, financial clout. So this is an important point to note, and for colleges to note, we should probably mark campuses where there's Hindu phobia, because going on to the next slide, because we spend so much at colleges, we could actually make our choices and make our voices heard. But on marriage, as expected, it's a similar trend: high rates of marriage, low rates of divorce. And among the second generation Indian Americans, you do see that there is, interracial marriages, non-Indian origin spouses, etc., and twice that of Indian origin Americans. So that's about it. So I guess that's an important finding, that there is a lot of the whole idea of caste is being debunked every single time. When you saw that slide on divisions, really the divisions or cleavages in the society were based a little bit on religion, but a lot of politics. And then here also, you don't see that. There's a lot of interracial, a lot of I think it would be good to understand how people are marrying within the Indian community as well, which is so diverse. So going on to the next slide, I think I just have conclusions. So the first point I wanted to make very clearly is that the questioning on the caste affiliation, first of all, not only did they narrow down on the Hindu group, but they also gave them pointers. Those are called, there's a slightly trick questions when you tell them, do you belong to general, SC, ST, OBC? Those are the forms we've filled all our lives. So caste affiliation is not the same as caste discrimination. I just wanted to put that out there. And another conclusion on the next page is that, this is a quote from their report where they say that this paper argues that while there is much that binds the community, the signs are that there is religious cleavages, generational divides, and political polarization. So I think there is a detailed study on generational divides, but where you see, the interracial marriages or, some of those issues and how they lean in terms of their, some of the political leanings and how they identify themselves in terms of their caste, because obviously people who have grown up here do not know those categories, which they have pointed out as caste. If I may repeat myself again, general, SC, ST, and OBC. So that's it. I think I'm going to the next slide. It's just a recommendation that I guess it would be good to go a little bit more granular into, some of those details of, I think, there's one more issue that I guess I probably did not go through that slide, but that Indian Americans versus South Asian identity. So there is a group of people, and it was found that Muslim Americans and Sikh Americans tend to identify themselves more as South Asians, versus a lot of the Hindu Americans tend to identify themselves as Indian Americans. So, so that I guess is an important sort of differentiator, and it may be interesting to see those perspectives, go a little bit more granular there and see how they differ in their overall leanings. And then, of course, an Hindu American survey would probably be a good way to go out and break into that sort of detail. So I think I end right there. Nikunji, did I do good time?
Yeah, no, it was good. I mean, thank you for that wonderful overview. I think there's some very good findings there, and given your background in this field, you did a great job providing that overview. What I want to do is now actually go into our discussion, because there are certain points that we discussed, right, when we were having this conversation. So I think there were in this survey, there's about 1,500 people that were surveyed, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
That's a fairly representative sample according to statistical methodology. So that's good. Now, let's talk about a few points, okay? So one point that I particularly noticed, and some of the folks who follow us on Twitter saw that we did a pretty interesting thread with 14 tweets highlighting some of these discussions that we had. There's also, there are points that, I think we'll want to talk about this. The first one is the services idea, right? Again, it assumes that Hindus come in just one shape or size as far as prayer services and things are concerned. And they did try to capture some of that. But I think if you're going to do a survey on Indian Americans, you also have to understand that Hindus in particular, right, while Muslims they do the namaz and go to mosques, and Christians go to churches, even Sikhs go to gurudwaras, for example, but Hindus come in various different types of shapes and sizes and affiliations, right? And I'll give an example. We were talking about this earlier. So I know some of my friends, for example, they do not go to mandir, but what they do is they have satsangs. So they talk about, they'll take the Bhagavad Gita and have a spiritual discussion about paths of karma yoga or jnana yoga. It's very philosophical, right? Another one, if you are into yoga and meditation, pranayama, you're not technically going to a mandir, but you are still connecting with divinity or you're the higher self, right? Some people focus on that. Some people are very much into it themselves. Like, there's like a self-focus. So they don't necessarily go to this typical prayer, quote unquote, prayer services, or do we even do puja. So some people don't even have any mandirs at home. And even if they have mandirs at home, they're not really doing puja. They're more only doing festivals or things like that. They may do some kind of a puja, right? So that nuance is not captured in the survey. And my apologies, I dropped my pen. What's very important for us to understand that, right? So that, because otherwise what ends up happening, it says Hindus pray less. So that idea of prayer is very different amongst the Hindus. And many of us, as you had mentioned, Hindus in name only, are also cultural Hindus, right? People who observe festivals. For them, practicing Hindu dharma is observing all the festivals and fasts. So they don't necessarily go to mandirs, they may just observe these festivals, right? So there's that combination, nuance is missing. So when we try to categorize us as just these praying people, that doesn't really apply to Hindus, right? The second point, and I think you brought up some of that, is about the whole idea of caste. Now, I want to talk about that. You have kind of, I grew up in India, but I came here when I was young. And so I had no exposure to this whole categorization that you had mentioned. I just learned about that much later, right? So I want to talk about that quickly. First one is that when you had mentioned about this SC/ST general category, by the way, it was just very recently that I found out there's something called a general category of caste.
Did I tell you that, Nikunji?
Yes, that was just like last week. So I'm like, what is a general category? And I have no idea what that means. So again, like for someone who has been raised as a Hindu American here, not born, but raised, I have no idea what these categories are, right? And I do research on these things. And even then I had no idea what general category was. So sometimes like these ideas of India, right? These categorizations of India do not apply to Hindu Americans who are born and raised in America, because these are not American categories. So when you try to say that, what is your caste? It reminds me of my research when the British asked the Hindus, what is your caste, in the first survey? And the questions was just puzzled everybody, because they're like, what do you mean by caste? Do you mean by jati? Do you mean varna? Do you mean gotra, kula, shreni, sampradaya? Which one of those categories do you mean? And we have the same problem here, I think. So it's like...
Absolutely.
So please go ahead.
And that is why I said, Nikunji, in my, that they should have an open-ended answer box right there, because then they can really tell, this is what they really meant. Maybe they were talking about the kula, the gotra, the jati, that's not a caste, but everyone has a different understanding of what that really means. So to have a close-ended question here, which none of the other surveys would ever do. So what happened to Carnegie Endowment here is what I'm asking.
Exactly. And that's a really important point, because if this survey, if I had taken the survey, right, I would probably not answer that question, because I'm like, well, I don't know what you mean by, I am born maybe in a Brahmin family, but that's not really my caste, because I know my gotra is something different, and then my jati may be something different, right? So there's a lot of these nuances. And when you come up with this idea of caste, right, it's a colonial trope, as you rightly put out, but it's like that survey continues, right? Even after in 1871 or 72, first caste survey was done where Hindus were asked about the caste. Now we have a same thing going on for all these years, and it continues on. At some point, hopefully we come up with a survey that doesn't go into this and is more diverse, right? So that's one very important point. Now, the second point, which I think this survey also brings out, is it automatically assumes caste is Hindu, right? Can you maybe tell us about like your experience with caste, or quote unquote caste, in other traditions? If you can, if you could share your thoughts.
Totally, if you think about it, I think it's a well-known fact. And I think, now that we are so fresh out of this California debate in the Human Rights Commission and whatnot, in fact, the whole California debate on caste is being led by Dalit Christians, as they call themselves, by Dalit, Sikhs, or, those caste privileged and all those kind of nuances, which for us as Hindus, we've sort of probably, transcended some of those identities. And also, so Sikhs, Mazhabi Sikhs, like you mentioned. And I think you're an expert, Nikunji, on that field, really. But from my understanding of the latest, battle that we've had at the Human Rights Commission in Santa Clara, I feel that, these whole ideas are being driven by the Christian, the Muslim, and the Sikh groups, who are calling themselves as, caste privilege, and they feel that there is this whole caste discrimination, which Carnegie Endowment study actually disproves that this is actually non-existent in the Hindu community, really. It's a very, very low level of understanding of caste identity. So then looks like they have a lot more understanding of caste identity. Please let's survey them for what they are doing, because that's how I see it, really. Yeah.
And you're right, and different communities have that understanding, because I mean, in this Santa Clara issue and California in general, we're continuously said that Indians equals caste, Hindus equal caste, and by the way, that also equals discrimination, right? So by default, Hindus have to have caste, and they have to by default discriminate, right? And this survey shows that even when you ask that problematic question about caste, even then you see that only 5% have observed that discrimination, right? And it's already a sample that's small, but within that sample also is 5%. So that completely debunks the idea that there's rampant, widespread caste discrimination in America. And that is, this Carnegie survey kind of debunks that theory, right? The other point that I can share is, the other point that we were talking about earlier was about this footnote 7 within the Carnegie survey, where they talk about Dalits being a Hindu identity. Again, I think that's a faulty point in the survey, because if you go to India, again, if you're going to use Indian categories, you got to use them properly, right? So if you go to India, you have Christian Dalits, you have Muslim Dalits, you have Hindu Dalits, Sikh Dalits, different types of Dalits. A Dalit is not a Hindu category, as the survey faultily says. So at one point, it's funny because, as we had pointed out in our tweet, one place they say that, we are aware that caste identities exist in Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Buddhists, etc., but then they only focus on Hindus, right? So again, you're trying to stereotype and reinforce that stereotype that Hindus equal caste. And then they also, right after that, they talk about Dalit being a Hindu identity, but they also say Muslims have OBC, other backward classes. So there's this like a mumbo jumbo stuff, or rather mixing of arguments. In one side, they're saying that there are castes that exist in different groups, but then let's only focus on Hindus, right? So I think that was a major problem that I personally felt, and then I think all of us in Kona really felt that this is not how Hindu Americans should be evaluated, right? It's the same issue that we face when you mentioned, like in schools and stuff, the Hindu phobia that we face. Again, you're stereotyping Hindus and you're reinforcing that identity.
Absolutely. And may I just add, Nikunji, that this survey was, administered in September. So I also have seen between the time of August, September to now, the narrative on caste is being driven in different ways. So that time they were focused on Hindu identity and just attaching caste to that. And when they saw the lot of pushback that the Hindu community is giving, I think they started to, in California, when the debate traveled there, they started talking about it as a pan-South Asian identity. So I have a feeling that all of these notes in the report were added, and that is why this identity, the U.S. at this time is going through a sort of a, identity politics, scenario. So this report is not removed from that. So they have added these points as an afterthought. I think that's an important point to note.
Yeah, and there's just to add on top of that, there's so much complication here that most mainstream Americans and even Indian Americans themselves don't understand, right? So when you say caste, okay, let's talk about this. What about people who are born and raised in America, as I mentioned, right? Why should they develop any kind of caste consciousness? As some of the Kona members have said, I have had to explain my daughters and my sons what caste is only when two things happen. In school, when they were taught the caste system as this hierarchical structure, right? They come home and they ask that question. And when these debates are going on, say, students who have never experienced these things or don't understand it, they have to all of a sudden become caste conscious and saying, wait a minute, am I from a high caste? And by the way, because I'm from high caste, I automatically discriminate, right? That is a very dangerous and Hindu-phobic approach. And that's what this survey, there's one danger of that survey be reinforcing that, right? Overall, a good survey, but this is a problematic thing for us. And then on top of that, what about people who get married between quote unquote intercaste marriages, right? So what do you do there? And then what about interracial marriages, right? Or a Hindu marrying a Christian marrying a Hindu? What happens there, right? Is that white? Let's say a white, like a white Hindu or like an Indian girl marries a white guy. Okay, what happens? Is she going to lose her quote unquote caste, or is the guy becoming casteist all of a sudden, right? So you have all these questions that
Absolutely.
are completely not in the nuances.
It's not in the nuances. And that is another thing that I pointed out during my presentation, that, they probably need to go granular into that aspect as to India. Okay, you're marrying within India, but India is a diverse phenomenon. You cannot just say, so if I marry someone in Kerala or someone, it's a whole different, amalgamation. Like you really lose some of those identity markers which they are talking about. So really, basically stop trying to pigeonhole Hindus, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Is what we are trying to say. And
exactly. I hope that in the future they don't have to ask caste, because why should caste continue? Like, it's like, okay, you're in India, you're still wanting to identify with the, you have forcing people to identify through like surveys and through sort of government, sanctioned, I guess, programs or whatever you call them. I'm not familiar with those programs, but let's say you come over here, you still are asked by the same thing, right? It's like, I remember when we did this presentation of, there was a 14-year-old Texas girl whose story I had highlighted. Her teacher basically said, so if I understand it correctly, Hindus are all about caste, right? That's what the teacher asked the girl. And there was a whole discussion about why that's not the case. But now the plan is we are continuing to reinforce those same stereotypes again and again. So it's like you can't get rid of that question no matter where you are in the world, because of persistence of this trope that we are like, it just follows us like a dark shadow no matter what we try to do. Like, as somebody pointed out, caste, cow, and curry, and in the comments, very, very important. So the other point I think, which I would like to also raise, is that Indian Americans born here have reported more discrimination. That's a very interesting point, because and I can tell you, there are many layers to that, right? One point you had mentioned earlier, and please feel free to add. One of the things that you had made is there is a idea of reporting, exactly. So a lot of educated people in America, when you're born and raised here or educated through the system here, you are encouraged to report these types of discriminations. But I also think that there are other elements to it. For example, over here, when people who are coming, they're coming as an adult. So they're usually coming in through post-college or into the workforce. So they may not experience as kind of discrimination, but if you're born and raised here, I can tell you, when I was in high school, I got discriminated in many different ways, right? One was because I was Indian, right, or Hindu, but also because I was, I was like, for example, for my religion, like they were telling how you are this, you worship cows and you're doing this and you eat monkey brains, that type of stuff, right? So I would likely report that more and more. And then I got bullied in high school because I was beaten up, those types of things. So you report that as well. And then as you go forward, you have other types of things. So there's a lot more, I think, awareness by people who are born and raised here, because they go through a different experience. And if you have come here, I would tell you, in the 70s and 80s and stuff like that, you may have faced discrimination like dot-busters and other types of things. So you may report that as discrimination, but not within the last 12 months, right? So that's very, I thought that was an interesting point there as well.
I think that was a very interesting point. One for me, actually, it just reinforces the point that we still see the US as a land of opportunity. For Indian Americans who come here as first generation, the kind of, opportunity you experience here is very different from what you see back home. And to that, may I just add the point about general category? There was a huge point being raised in the report that 83% call themselves general category, and they are the ones who seem to dominate. But I think there needs to be a more granular study as to, do they lack opportunities back home, right? Because the general category, I remember Narayan Murthy saying that his son could not get through in any of the premier institutes in India, and it was so easy for him to get here in the Ivy Leagues, So now he's the Infosys chairman and founder. So basically what we're trying to say here is that, maybe the general category tends to come here, or who are called the upper caste, because they lack, that level of opportunity back home.
Yeah, and again, there's a very detailed, complex conversation because there's so many layers there, social, cultural, political, government policies, so many different types of layers as far as that is concerned. So, but as far as the survey of Indian Americans is concerned, those types of things should not really apply, according to me, because those Indian Americans may be born in India, raised here, or come from India as an immigrant just in college or whatever, or born here, right? It's a combination, of mix of different things. So you can't automatically assume that these categories apply to everybody, right? How the British assumed in their censuses that, this is caste, so everything is caste.
Yes, absolutely. So this is, again, like I said, it's a second, blow. I mean, we were pigeonholed in like the 1800s and early 1900s. And now, again, there is this whole idea of trying to put us in this box and trying to put, the trope back onto us. So I think there is the need for a great pushback. But, the good news, Carnegie Endowment does give us some good news. First of all, they totally debunk equality labs, which I think, we probably need to throw a party for that. We need to have a celebration because this comes from a very credible source. We as Indian Americans, when we cry horse, people think we are biased, but here we have a very credible, statistically sound team that completely debunks and, their methodology, their unrepresentative, and completely their findings are so different from equality labs. So very Absolutely. Big reason to celebrate there.
Yeah, and that's really important because, once we are accused of being casteist, okay? And then on top of that, we are told that, hey, you cannot respond because you are an upper caste privileged person. First of all, I don't, upper caste privilege in America, I do not agree with. I am telling you from my own perspective, since I was 15 years old, I've worked like the lowest jobs you can think about, cutting meats, so sweeping floors, whatever, from an economics perspective, I was making $2 an hour type of a job. So all the time, you cannot just say, oh, people you're always caste privileged. And one of the worst things that happens to Hindus is that kids who are born and raised here are automatically being sort of like pushed to say, I'm an upper caste privileged person, as if them being born all of a sudden gives them, like this sort of superiority, which is completely, nonsense. So we have been talking about this for a long time, and we have been trying to say that these things do not exist in America, but nobody wants to believe us. And that's really unfortunate because one thing is you accuse the community of being casteist, and then you do not let them respond, because essentially you're being you're guilty till proven innocent, but you're not even allowed to prove yourself innocent. So that's what my problem is, and I'm glad that the Carnegie Mellon survey, the Carnegie Endowment survey, not a Carnegie Mellon survey, Carnegie Endowment survey brings out that point. And like you said rightly, that is really, really important and good news for the Hindu American community that is fighting these battles and being accused of rampant caste discrimination. And as we can see in the survey, that is not, I'm not going to say it doesn't exist, but the amount of existence is very small, only 5 to 6%, as we saw in the survey, right? So even, and as you mentioned, it was taken at a certain time where these issues are being highlighted more and more. So when you ask someone, did you experience caste discrimination? The person who may be from a different category may respond in the affirmative, right? So there's all these different types of challenges with that.
I do want to point out a couple of things. Of course, yeah, as a minority here, and as you said, this cancel culture really has to stop. Where you are an upper caste privileged person, just stop talking. Only the Dalit voices need to be heard. But secondly, I also want to talk about the caste 5% caste discrimination. So out of I think about 600 plus, like close to 672 or 692 people. I don't have the numbers with me right now, but out of that, about less than 300 said that they faced discrimination, right? And of those, there's a 5%, right?
Correct.
Of those 300. So it's a very, very small, minuscule sample. So, it could be in single digits. So it's not a reliable sample base, first of all, for projections. And it is not at all. So I like the fact that this is a sound survey. They have their footnotes. They have most of their footnotes make sense, except for that Dalit one, like you mentioned. So it's a really well designed analysis and survey. So hats off to that Carnegie Endowment team. But maybe next time they need to put in some, be less lazy, put some open-ended questions in there and analyze those, because that's typical of all race and identity questionnaires.
Correct. Yeah. So we can of course continue chatting as much as we can, but I think we're running out of time. But I think if people have any questions, they can put it there. Someone asked who uses these types of surveys. I'll answer that first. Many different types of people use surveys, right? Academics use surveys. People who are studying South Asian history departments.
You just froze, Nikunji. Can you hear me? I think your screen just froze, Nikunji. So okay. So oh, there you are. I think you froze for a moment. I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Can you hear me? Technology. So all I was saying is that university departments use a survey, like South Asian departments. They will also use religion departments use surveys. Sometimes government entities may use surveys. So different types of people end up using surveys. Of course, those who want to project certain types of biases also use surveys, right? Because they'll use surveys saying, see, I see this discrimination here, and therefore blah, 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 right? But good news is this survey has kind of not given them the opportunity, as we will see. So, but please, your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think, Nikunj, you covered most of it. And, I think even, like I said, we used to earlier just see South Asians clubbed into this big bucket of, just the Asian American, Pacific Islander and Hawaiians and all of those in one bucket, So this is going to really bring out that identity, when they start studying us in more detail, this is just probably the first few steps as the community gets critical momentum and mass. So we, it's always good because then you will have products designed for you. I'm sort of in the corporate field. I have done lots of studies and surveys there. So it really is a good thing that they are getting down to the nitty-gritty of who an Indian American really is. So, we might find, like, in California, you already find that, you'll find ghee and, dahi and all of those, maybe dosa dough on your mainstream shelves,
Yeah, in Costco.
Costco's.
That's right.
Jersey. I guess you have that privilege. So that's the sort of thing you'll start to see, because they start to map you much better and much more granular when you start seeing these sort of surveys coming up. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's really important. And I think someone asked what do we see as consequences of collecting and publishing such surveys, both intended and unintended consequences?
I think it's a very good question. Can I take it first? And then,
please, yeah.
So, see, first of all, I always see this from a political angle because I do see the big trend here of the progressive left driving this identity politics, whether it is through critical race theory in schools and curriculums, or it is through, all these surveys, which, if you see the trend, identity politics, identity surveys are getting much, much more granular, So this Caste survey is obviously the first, but not the last, And it's also, going to probably go a little bit more granular. So I think it's an important thing for us to also get a handle on this. But the fact, what Nikunji, you just mentioned, that the more we talk about it, the more people get aware of it and start to discuss it. And do we really want it? I think that is the big question at this time, Do we want these kind of markers? Columbia University just had a convocation where I think they had a separate ceremony for Hispanics, separate for Black Americans, and separate for white Americans. Do we want that? We need to have surveys on that rather than pushing, these things on people, because people are actually, coming out. Some of them are at least coming out and speaking about it.
Yeah, and that's going to be a very charged, I think for the next several years, we're going to see that part, and what sort of part Indian Americans and Hindu Americans will play there is going to be important. So I think some of these surveys are bringing up these things and publishing them, right? What else? Tell me, and then maybe I'll share my thoughts.
Oh, I'm sorry. What was the question?
No, the unintended or unintended consequences. Anything else you want to share?
No, I think that's the most important thing, that, the unintended consequence is that, people start discussing it and identifying with it and seeing more and more discrimination where none may exist. Like right now, we are seeing surveys where 60+% almost said that they don't face discrimination. They see it as a land of opportunity. But as we stop talking about opportunity and we stop talking about America as, so far we think of it as an American dream, buying a home, buying a good car, driving on the freeways. Those are the dreams that Indian Americans come to the US with, with a high education, things like that. But now if you start talking about identity politics, this is a very Marxist, way of thinking and socialist way of thinking. So those are the big, fallouts of this and of this sort of analysis, discourse, which is nonstop being, peddled in the media. So I use the word peddled very seriously because that's what's happening. These stories like the Cisco Caste case, or if you talk about the BAPS case, they are taking a labor law case and turning it into a Dalit, discrimination case in BAPS, for example. And then here, again, so the stories are very manipulated, and all of these convocations and things like that. So these are not conducive to a meritocratic society. That is the underlying consequence. I love that question because for me, that bothers me, because we have seen this identity politics in India. All vote banks are created accordingly. People are appeased accordingly, so smaller minorities get together and vote, things like that. So vote bank politics is another consequence of it. So those are the consequences and fallouts which are not positive from these kind of discourses. Mm-hmm.
And that's going to have an impact on Hindu Americans as we become more sort of broader, right, as far as generations are concerned, political affiliations are concerned. So all of those things will have an impact. We're already seeing that, right? Many students are involved in different sides of the debate. You see this whole idea that just because I'm a Hindu and I'm from this family, I am already a caste privileged person, as if they understand what that really means. And how does that apply in America, right? My question always has been, okay, I'm not going to debate about what happens in India. I have my own theories on that. But please tell me, how the heck does that apply in America? How does this idea apply in America? Where do you see your caste giving you privileges of getting jobs, of getting some kind of entitlement in America? No, economically, yes, I understand that, because if you're from a sort of a richer background, richer family, you may have greater access to social networks that may get you to different connections and all that stuff. But I vehemently disagree on this idea of you're a born caste privilege. It's like the Criminal Tribes Act that the British put in 1871, that if you're born in this particular jati, you are a criminal in general. And I see that happening in America, when people are saying that you're born as a Hindu, you're born in this family, you're automatically an upper caste and you have a privilege and therefore you discriminate. So that for me is, through these surveys, it could also have unintended consequences. But luckily in this particular survey, that doesn't happen. So I'm very happy about that. So I would say that overall, just to conclude, the survey has some good points. We have some concerns and clarifications, which we talked about, but we do want to wish the Carnegie Endowment team good luck in future surveys. We're happy to share our perspectives on that. We can talk to them, clarify what we are concerned as far as Hindu Americans are concerned. But I think that the survey does bring out some good points, especially the ones that we have been trying to argue against, that the caste discrimination angle is pretty much either small or non-existent in America, based on sampling and things like that. So thank you again for people who are joining us. This was a great discussion. Richaji, as always, good to have your perspective on things. Thank you for the earlier presentation and the various thoughts. Yes. And we namaste to all the viewers. And this will be available on Facebook and YouTube as soon as the live thing ends.
Thank you so much, Nikunji. Thank you to everybody.
Namaste.
Yes. Namaste.